Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today we will discuss the species taxon with reference to the infraspecific categories and terms. The first infraspecific category and term is the variety. Variety is a term which is used for intrapopulational variation. The term of variety is no longer being used by the taxonomists. It is basically a heterogeneous potpourri of the individual variants and races. And we can take an example of rice, for which we generally use the word variety, that this variety of rice is not so good as compared to the other variety. So variety is not a taxonomic term. The subspecies. Subspecies was the term used in replacement of variety or geographic race. It is the lowest taxonomic term, like that of morphological species. Variety and subspecies can be used interchangeably for variants, for geographic race, and even sibling species. Subspecies are always allopatric and allochronic, and if taxonomists report subspecies from the same area, it means that there is a strong chance of incorrect usage of the term, with exception to the case of the migratory species and parasites, where sympatric subspecies can be found. Under the morphological species concept, the definition of subspecies is on the basis of the delimitation of the subspecies on the basis of morphology in sympatric samples. Subspecies is a different category from that of the species. Neither there is specific criteria for its delimitation, nor it is considered as a unit of evolution. However, its importance is recognized where it is related to a geographic or genetic isolate. The subspecies is defined as the aggregate of phenotypically similar populations of a species inhabiting a geographical subdivision of the range of that species, and differs taxonomically from other populations of that species. There are various other reasons for wording of this particular definition of the subspecies. Number one, although the members of the subspecies are extremely similar, yet there are slight phenotypic and genotypic differences, and some say that subspecies is a collective category. Then these differences between two slightly variant populations present at two localities can be measured using various molecular and statistical analysis. The more detailed sampling will be carried out, the more differential diagnostics can be carried out among the subspecies. And the addition of trinomial name for the subspecies definitely leads to the confusion. Generally, we use the binomial nomenclature for referring a species. The first name is refers the genus, the second refers the species. But if we add trinomial nomenclature, it will be a bit more confusing. So the practice of trinomial name is only important when subspecies differs conspicuously in terms of diagnostic characters. Differential diagnostics means that the identification is on the basis of the differences. In case of the subspecies, the differences are mostly morphological, whereas in case of the species, these differences are in terms of ecological niches, species-specific genetic markers, and reproductive isolation or reproductive gap. So every local population is different from that of the other. The ranges of the variation of neighboring population overlap, due to which there cannot be the assignment of populations to the subspecies. There is a misusage of the word overlap, except in case of the circular overlap. The circular overlap is defined as the phenomenon in which a change of contiguous and intergrading populations curve back until the terminal links overlap with each other geographically and behave like good non-interbreeding species. So the term overlap can only be used for breeding ranges of two species. However, it cannot be used for the breeding ranges of the subspecies, except in case of circular overlap. The characteristics of two subspecies combine where two subspecies reproduce to produce a hybrid. The two subspecies never overlap in any area, as these are variants of the single species, no matter to what extent they are variable, or no matter how variable they are. There were certain difficulties in the application of the subspecies category. First of all, they have been misused during their application. The authors have misused the term by applying it to the individual variants or the sibling species. Sibling species are those species which are extremely similar, however they are two different species. So the term cannot be applied to them because they have already achieved the status of a complete species. Then naming insignificantly different local populations as subspecies. So that was another mistake done by the misuse done by the taxonomists by naming the local populations as subspecies which are insignificantly different, which are not at all different from each other. Then number 3, considering every subspecies a unit of evolution. However, it is not a unit of evolution. Subspecies is just a device, an object present in the animate system or present in the living world to facilitate intraspecific classification. There are 4 aspects which reduce the usefulness of the subspecies. Number 1, different characters show geographic variation. So the tendency of different characters to show independent trends of geographic variation that reduces the usefulness of the subspecies. Number 2, how to deal with allopatric populations that are extremely similar. They are generally called polytopic species. So the independent occurrence of similar or phenotypically indistinguishable populations in geographically separated species, it becomes difficult to apply the concept of subspecies. The occurrence of microgeographic races within formally recognized subspecies causes another difficulty. So what to do with microgeographic races? Either they should be called subspecies or they should not be called subspecies. Number 4, the arbitrariness of the degree of distinction considered by different specialists as justifying subspecific separation of slightly differentiated local populations, and what should be the criteria of the degree of difference. What should be the criteria of the degree of difference to designate a population as subspecies? However, still sensible usage of the subspecies category makes the classification convenient in population samples in geographically variable species. So, subspecies is a term which is used as a device to carry out intraspecific classification. So it has to be used very sensibly, very technically to support classification, to support the process of classification. There are certain practical problems faced by a population taxonomist, and being a student of taxonomy, we must not be confused that how we can deal with the infraspecific categories such as subspecies. These are the practical problems which are faced by a population taxonomist, that how different must a population be in order to justify its recognition as subspecies? And if there are two populations of a species, there are certain intermediate zones where the two populations merge to produce intermediate population, and if that particular intermediate population is there, then how should it be treated? Then how does one delimit subspecies against adjacent subspecies? If there are two subspecies, for example, there are within a species there are two subspecies, so how we can delimit one subspecies against another subspecies? Should one recognize polytopic subspecies for indistinguishable but geographically separated populations? When should geographic isolates be called species? At what point we can say that this geographical isolate has completely attained the status of a species? At what point they should be called as subspecies? These are general practical problems which are faced by a population taxonomist. So, as we are practicing the taxonomy in the field, as a paleontologist or as a taxonomist, we need to address these questions depending upon what species or what animal we are working on. So the strategies also change as the animal or as the organism under study changes. So that depends upon what organism you are working on. Either that is an invertebrate or a. So temporal subspecies is another term which is used in paleontology as well. In paleontology there are certain different populations which are separated in time and often designated as subspecies. So how we can distinguish between temporal and geographic subspecies? The answer is always there that it is not advisable to use separate terms for temporal and geographic subspecies, as it is impossible to determine whether a subspecies are contemporary. Contemporary means that they are of the same era when they are found from the different localities, or when they are found in a sequence at a single locality. We cannot easily distinguish, or we cannot easily determine that whether these subspecies which have been found from different localities or they have been found from a sequence at a single locality, either they are contemporary or not. So subspecies found in succeeding strata may actually be geographic races that replaced each other due to certain climatic changes. A paleontologist faces difficulties to understand the relationship of fossils with that of the living species. They require to do a deeper analysis. As compared to a neontologist who works on the museum specimen, there are certain problems which are faced by a paleontologist. A paleontologist who works on fossils can find specimens that may belong to different age classes, or they may belong to different sexes, or they may belong to non-genetic habitat forms of the same species. So it is important that we consider fossils as remains of different morphotypes, which definitely leads us to deeper analysis and better understanding of the relationships and the meaning of evolutionary trends. The race. The term race is not recognized in a taxonomic hierarchy. The term race in subspecies can be used interchangeably, particularly in birds and insects. However, other taxonomists apply the word race to local populations within a particular subspecies. The environment of two localities are never identical, so every subspecies is at least theoretically an ecological race. How races vary? The races differ in their ecological requirement. and the races depend on the gene flow between two populations. The concept of gene flow must be discussed here. In population genetics, gene flow is basically the transfer of genetic variation from one population to another. If gene flow from one population to another population is high, then the two populations have the same allelic frequency, and therefore these populations become single population and thereby single species or single subspecies and single race. On the other hand, if gene flow between parasite population on two different hosts is reduced, then the two host plants will become races. We use the parasites as a confirmatory test during our working or during the process of identification. In the upcoming lectures, you will be learning about the taxonomic characters, which are extremely important for the identification of any organism. And in those lectures, you will be able to understand that how parasite populations are very important to understand the differences in the species. So, if the gene flow between parasite populations on different hosts is reduced, then the two hosts will become races. You can easily understand the concept of human races. The Cline. The difference in a particular character results in character gradient throughout a population. So, a Cline is formed by a series of contiguous populations in which a given character changes gradually. A Cline is formed by a series of populations sharing a common borderline in which a particular character changes. The character may be morphological, that may be physiological, or that may be any other genetically determined character. So, but the Cline has never been given a nomenclatural recognition. Infra-subspecific categories. There are two other terms which have been a part of these subspecific categories. However, these have not been recognized nomenclaturally. Natio is the term proposed when subspecies was being defined typologically. Natio was a term to subdivide heterogeneous subspecies into smaller uniform taxa. The taxa, or the living organisms or the animate objects which were uniform, they were being considered in one natio. So the subspecies was being considered as heterogeneous, and they were further being divided into smaller groups. That was called natio on the basis of the uniformity. But it was not much popular, as it was realized that every local population is genetically different from even every other local population, which is very few miles apart. And secondly, these populations are not sharply separated from each other. So there is no excuse for a formal recognition of these local innumerable recognitions. Then there was another term, deem, which was adopted by zoologists for the evolutionary unit corresponding to the local population. But it was also not very much recognized nomenclaturally. However, it is used to group certain or to establish an aggregate of the animals for a particular working of in the field of taxonomy. Superspecies. A superspecies is a monophyletic group of closely related and largely or entirely allopatric. Monophyletic organisms are those that share a common descent, and these are in the same taxon. This means that all descendants are of a common ancestor, so they have typical shared characters, and if they are entirely allopatric, it means they belong to a superspecies. if the member species are shown on a map, then they will look similar to the plot of polytopic species. However, these species have attained reproductive isolation. Secondly, these may be extremely different from each other. And thirdly, these may be in geographic contact in some area without interbreeding. Superspecies are not given nomenclatural recognition but are listed as such in monographs and catalogs by an appropriate use of headings or symbols, and they are very important in geographical or speciation studies or evolutionary studies. So they have their own position in the field of taxonomy. Intrapopulation variants. There are certain, these are the taxa. The taxa are basically certain populations, and these populations are basically the material for the analysis. And these populations are basically phenotypically variant due to what they are referred as phenna, and they have not been given a taxonomic status. They are just used to understand or to carry out the work of or to carry out the process of taxonomy and identification. Similarly, there are many other neutral terms which have been introduced to refer the aggregates of forms and have not been given nomenclatural recognition. But this intrapopulational variant, the concept of intrapopulational variations will be discussed in our upcoming lecture, and that is, there is a whole big concept of this point, because intrapopulational variants are cause extreme confusion for a taxonomist while doing its while completing the process of identification. Thank you so much for listening to the lecture, and definitely there might be some questions from your side which you may ask it on the same forum, and I will be able to answer all those questions.